All right, so let's talk about attacks and attacker categories. But before we get a chance to actually figure out what's going on during an attack or how to mitigate it, there's a process that companies should go through, which is called a risk assessment. And the risk assessment aims to clarify or to specify exactly what type of risk and how much risk are we currently facing, right? How risky it is to continue doing business as we're doing right now. But in order to define what exactly we need for that risk assessment, we're going to have to focus our attention on two major areas in security. The first one being the vulnerabilities that we currently have in our systems. Now, a vulnerability is any kind of weakness that makes it easier for an attacker to perform an attack on our system. It could be a flaw in hardware, it could be a software vulnerability, it could be a misconfiguration. It could be that you're lacking some sort of a security control, that you simply forget to enable encryption on a link, for example. It could be the fact that we're not validating, we're not checking the input that we're receiving from our users. It could be any number of things. But a vulnerability is a weakness that could be exploited by an attacker. The second one is the threat. Now, the threat is the actual potential of something or someone or an attacker or an unfortunate event of exploiting that vulnerability. The threat needs to be measured as well, because we could know that we actually have vulnerability in there, but we could also, let's say, prove that the vulnerability cannot be exploited, because it requires, I don't know, maybe perhaps physical access to the system. And we know for sure that nobody has physical access to that system. So we could have a high vulnerability with a low threat, or vice versa. That's why we're combining these two, not exactly in a mathematical operation, but we're combining them inside of a risk assessment report. So we say that the risk represents the vulnerability and a specific threat associated with that vulnerability. So to determine if we actually have a type of risk that's worth considering, we need to know exactly what's the vulnerability that we have and how likely that vulnerability is to be exploited. Now, there used to be a time when security in IT basically meant scanning for viruses. And we didn't really have that many viruses out there. We had some very well-maintained databases with static signatures in there, and that was about it. Well, nowadays, attack techniques and attackers have become so complex that we simply cannot rely on static signatures anymore. So nowadays, we don't just focus on the vulnerability itself, we also focus on the attacker type, their motivation, their intent perhaps, in order to understand what are the end goals of that attack, in order to understand how an attack might behave even if we don't have a static signature to detect it right out of the box. All right, so we have to focus on a couple of attacker attributes which were developed over time in order to better characterize the persons or the groups behind the cyber attacks nowadays. And one of the first things that we should focus on is whether the attackers are internal or external. Now, an external attacker is probably the idea that you have in your mind about a, let's say, normal hacker out there. So it's somebody who doesn't have access to a company or to a network and tries to break their way in, to circumvent some security systems, to bypass some authentication methods, and to gain access to some confidential information. That's the external attacker, the one that doesn't have any kind of privileges and has to find a way to penetrate that that enclosed perimeter, which might be a logical perimeter if it's just a company network. Now, on the other hand, we also have internal attackers, and internal attackers, also known as insider threats, are actually even more dangerous than external ones, because an internal attacker is basically somebody who already has access, already has some level of privileges inside your network and decides one day to do some nasty stuff. It could be an employee, it could be your colleague, it could be a business partner that has VPN access to some of your applications. If somebody on the inside suddenly decides to perform some malicious actions, they're going to be that more dangerous because they already have some level of privileges, which the external attacker doesn't have. And so they get a head start, a dangerous head start. We also have to look at intent. What is the actual reason behind that attacker's attack? Do they want to destroy data? Do they want to deface some websites? Do they want to steal confidential information? Do they want to hold ransom some piece of data for you to pay in return for that data? This is also one of the things that needs to be understood in order to better mitigate attacks. Also related to intent, we find motivation. Motivation is more on the psychological side of things. I mean, if it's an internal threat, an insider threat, the motivation might be that it's just a disgruntled employee, somebody who is not content with the current way the business is being conducted. So they have some sort of grievance against management or against the company. They could be somebody who militates for specific rights or laws that they don't agree with. They could be motivated by greed, of course. A lot of the financial threats out there are motivated by greed and an intent to steal money. And sometimes you even find motivation behind curiosity, because some people are just curious to see, well, is this system something that I can bypass? Can I crack the system? Can I gain access to this database just to see if I can? And they want to do this just to see if they're able to do it. It's like a challenge to them. And finally, we can look at capabilities. This is the amount of resources that the attacker has at their disposal in order to conduct their attacks. Now, it might be just somebody has decided one day to use some freely available tools on the internet, so they don't really have any resources available. It's just that they have the right tools to conduct the attack. But a more dangerous alternative to this is an attacker or an attacker group that actually invests time, effort, money into developing custom tools that target specific companies or specific people in order to conduct some attacks that are so customized, so new, that nobody can detect them, perhaps not even a while after the attack has completed. So when talking about ways to categorize threats, we also have to look at the attacker types. The first type that we're going to be talking about is the hacker. You might think, well, aren't they all hackers? Why is there anything else besides the hacker? Well, the hacker is just a generic term. That's true. But one important thing here to remember is that the term hacker, even though nowadays does have a bad name attached to it, now historically, the hacker was actually a person who was able to use a system in a different way than the system was designed for. Now, if you think about it, this definition still stands, because hackers actually manage to exploit authentication systems, make applications execute foreign code, or crash applications, or crash online services, or access confidential information. And those are all operations that the hackers are performing, which those targets should not allow them to perform. So they're actually using them outside the way that the database, the website, the application was designed. So that's a hacker. And you've probably heard about black hat hackers, white hat hackers. No, black hats are the bad hackers, right? The ones that are actually pursuing, financial interest. They're trying to destroy, deface websites or steal confidential information. On the other hand, we have white hat hackers. We also call them penetration testers because we use them to research vulnerabilities, to test for vulnerabilities, and they immediately report them in order for them to be fixed. And somewhere in between, we find also gray hat hackers, which might have, mixed feelings about whether they report the vulnerabilities that they find or not. Or we also sometimes consider gray hat hackers to be those who find vulnerabilities, find weaknesses in software or in publicly available products in order to gain a financial advantage by reporting them and accessing something called a bug bounty, because many companies out there will actually pay security analysts and security researchers that are able to find flaws and defects in their products and report them back to them, right? So instead of going ahead and exploiting that vulnerability for your own gain, you go to the company, tell them, I just found this in your code, and they give you a reward for it, right? And of course, they move on to fixing that flaw in their code. So we consider gray hat hackers somewhere in this area as well. Next, we have the script kiddies. They're not actually kiddies, but these are hackers who use hacking tools without understanding how they work. They just download a piece of software that says this piece of software is going to crack the password from a zip archive, or this piece of software is going to launch a denial of service on a web server. You just have to enter the IP address in there and click a button, It's not going to tell you what it does. You don't even know how it does. You might even not know how a denial of service actually works. But that software is going to do its job. You just have to use it, right? Hackers who use tools like these without actual having knowledge, hacking knowledge about them, these are called script kiddies. Hacktivists are most likely hackers who have some sort of a political agenda behind them. They are militating for or against some governmental position, some sort of a party, or any type of legislation or things that are happening in the public space where they're living or around the world. So basically the term comes from the term of activist, but they're using hacking tools to reach their objectives. Next, we have the APTs, or the Advanced Persistent Threats, and this term has sort of a double meaning. Now, the first meaning of the term actually refers to the attack itself. So Advanced Persistent Threat means some sort of an attack which has the ability of maintaining access to a system, not just gaining access and doing something and then leaving, but also maintaining access over time, perhaps gathering data over time, maybe covering its tracks. There are a lot of examples in the media of APTs attacks that have been detected even months after they have been initially installed. These are the types of attacks where hackers manage to install their own tools, their own software inside of a company, and they manage to keep it hidden in there for months or years in a row, silently monitoring, gathering data, or sending or altering information inside the systems of that company. The second meaning of this term actually refers to the group that is conducting such attacks. As you can probably guess, conducting such an attack is no easy business and usually requires customized tools, customized attack methods, perhaps even combined with social engineering and other attack vectors. And the group that are performing these attacks and that are behind those tools are called APT groups. Now, of course, the APT groups are right now only the ones that we know about. So these are the APT groups that have been identified, historically identified, or we have some limited certainty that they are located in a certain country and they are behind certain attacks. Because we cannot be always sure, 100% sure, which APT group is actually behind an attack, even if they claim to be. So this website right here provides you with a short overview of the known APT groups out there. You can see that the naming convention here is not awfully original. It's APT followed by a number 39, 35, 34, 40 something. I believe that right now we are around 40 or 50 or so. Again, it doesn't mean that these are all the APT groups out there. It's just the ones that we've been able to identify. Next, we have criminal syndicates, which are somehow related to APT groups, because in most cases, APTs are actually related to cybercrime as well, and organized groups at the level and complexity of APT groups are more often than not sponsored by dedicated countries and governments out there. So the goals here could be just theft, it could be espionage, it could be gathering military intelligence, and so on. But criminal syndicates, not only that they can have political motivation behind them, but they usually target critical infrastructure at the level of an entire country, like energy, gas, oil, and so on. And one of the reasons why cybercrime becomes so difficult to investigate is the fact that there are no clear boundaries. Who is located where, who is attacking who, which resource is located under whose jurisdiction, and so on. Everything is sort of a blurred lines when it comes to cyber attacks, so that they're extremely difficult to detect, mitigate, and then prosecute. And finally, last type of attacker, which is kind of obvious, right? It could be a competitor of your company. The reasons here might be to put you out of business, to make you lose some part of your market share, to steal some intellectual property from your company, or sometimes just to damage the reputation of a specific vendor or a specific company. And as you can probably guess, a lot of the situations where competitors or attacks led by competitors are successful rely on insider threats. It might be somebody that is currently working in your company that has been bribed or motivated in some other way or threatened by a competitor, or it could be somebody that has left your company and has started working for a competitor. All right, so a special category of attackers, and a really dangerous one for that matter, is the insider threat. As we said before, the insider could be your colleague, somebody who is part of the company. And the big problem here from a security perspective is the fact that if they decide one day to act in a malicious manner, they already have access inside of the company. They already have some level of access, even if they're just a regular user, a regular employee. And not to mention the situation when the insider threat comes from a person in the IT department. They probably already have admin rights over the network devices, over the hosts in their network. So there's a huge risk right here inside of your network, inside of your company, if at some point an employee decides to go rogue. And the big problem here is that they're just so difficult to detect. Because if you're dealing with somebody who already has access to the security devices, to the logs that are being generated, the event logs that are being generated for potential security incidents, and they have access to those storage devices, of course they can tamper with them. So sometimes detecting an insider threat might be the most difficult part of defending your network. And we have to also make a difference here between intentional and unintentional insider threats. And I think everybody can guess what an intentional insider threat might look like, all right? It's just somebody who decides one day to act in a malicious manner, to steal some data, to tamper with the company's database, to impersonate another user, to commit fraud perhaps by tampering with or generating fake invoices, or by stealing data so that it could be provided to a competitor. But what about unintentional threats? Well, unintentional threats usually stem from the fact that most users are not so security aware, not just in IT companies, but in companies everywhere. So users that don't have security training might expose their accounts, might expose their workstations, their mobile devices without knowing, right? A poor password management policy, a poor screen locking policy, or any kind of security measures that they just ignore can expose their devices, and through their devices they can expose your entire network. And this is unintentional, but it is a lack of education, lack of awareness on their side. Another unintentional way of exposing your network is by installing unauthorized devices or enabling unauthorized services in your network. For example, hosting file sharing services from the company network, or installing rogue devices such as wireless access points or foreign switches that are not part of the company managed devices. Usually this type of, let's say, additional IT infrastructure that kind of lies on top of the enterprise infrastructure is called shadow IT. And that's a term that usually suggests that people are using services or using devices that are not authorized, or the IT department doesn't even know about them. Another example of shadow IT would be, for example, employees suddenly deciding to use a public file sharing service or file synchronization service to store their company files, their company data, which probably isn't secure enough or isn't accepted by the company security policy. So while talking about exposure, now would be a good time to introduce the term of attack surface. Now the attack surface is, just like the name says, is the amount of points of entry that a potential attacker could use to exploit your network or your systems. So it's basically the answer to the question of how exposed are you to potential threats, to potential attacks. Now, of course, ideally, the attack surface for an outsider threat should be much smaller than the attack surface for an insider threat, which happens, as we said before, because an insider threat already has a level of access that the outside attacker still needs to gain before moving forward with their attack intentions. The attack surface in itself is a big topic in any security assessment, because it needs to be evaluated while thinking about all the potential points of entry in your network. I mean, not just, open ports or a firewall or open ports on your servers, but think about mobile devices when they leave your building. Think about your actual employees that might be subjected to social engineering, and they could be tricked into divulging secret information. Or even think about physical security, how difficult it is for somebody from the outside to actually enter your building and sit at a desk and access confidential data from your company. So that's also part of an attack surface. So we said that an attack surface represents the multitude of points of entry, potential points of entry that could be exploited. Well, one such point of entry is actually called an attack vector, which is the method or the vector by which an attack can happen. All right, so let's put a couple of these attack vectors here on the slide and see what they're all about. Starting with email, the traditional point of entry of malware and malicious intent in your network. So with email, an attacker could potentially craft a message that tricks a user into clicking a link, downloading some malware, or exploiting some kind of vulnerability in their browser. Now, usually this type of approach combines the email vector with some sort of social engineering attempt, because it does have to look legit in order to convince that user that they should actually click on that link or download that attachment or execute that attachment that came with the original email. Next, we have the removable media threat vector. That is the USB thumb drives that everybody's using nowadays, and which are often involved in transmitting malware. It usually relies on the fact that you manage to trick a user into inserting a USB stick into their own company computer or laptop, and there are a lot of methods for doing so. Again, this requires some sort of social engineering, but let me just give you an interesting example here. It's called the parking lot attack, and it relies on intentionally leaving actual USB sticks somewhere thrown away inside of a parking lot where regular users could find them. And they would find such a USB stick on the ground and say, boy, this is my lucky day. I just found a 256 gigabyte stick for free in the parking lot. Somebody must have dropped it. Let me just take it and enjoy it. And they grab it and they plug it inside of the company laptop, and voila, you have the malicious content being injected directly inside of a company computer, bypassing any kind of firewall controls, IPSs, IDSs that you might encounter if you were to try to inject that same type of code from the outside over the internet. So that's a parking lot attack. Of course, you can imagine this attack happening in any number of ways. You know, leaving those USB sticks in the lunch area, in the lobby, anywhere, you know, regular employees that are not so security concerned might grab them and stick them in their own company devices. Wireless is another very common attack vector simply because it's open. Not open as in anybody can connect, but the signal itself is not constrained to a specific path. I mean, anybody can intercept that signal, even though it's encrypted most of the time, but you don't even have to be inside of a building to catch that wireless signal. You could be outside in a parking lot, even outside of the company perimeter, outside of the fence, and you could still get some packets, receive some packets that are actually traveling over the company network. There are numerous attacks in the wireless world. We're going to talk about them in a different video, but for now, just to mention a couple of them, most of the time it relies on intercepting that traffic, trying to crack the authentication credentials, the wireless password of the network, in order to gain access to the company network, or in an attempt to perform a man-in-the-middle, that is intercepting legitimate company traffic, looking inside of those packets, and then forwarding back to their original destination. Now, of course, we do have security methods in place that don't allow this to happen so easily, but the wireless networks do pose a much bigger risk than wired networks. Next, we have the websites, social media, instant messaging services, which are not exactly attack vectors by themselves, but of course they could host malware, but they're most likely going to be used in a social engineering attempt. Think of a situation where an attacker poses as a legitimate employee on social media, on an instant messaging platform, and attempts to get more information from you. They could pretend to be from IT, from tech support. They could pretend to be a contractor that doesn't have access yet to the company network, and they need some help to figure out how your internal authentication systems work so that they can get the access that they deserve, quote unquote. Local workstation access. This one is often overlooked. People don't understand how critical this is. It's simply protecting your computer when you stand up from your desk and leave your desk. That is, don't allow anybody to just sit down at your desk and start typing at your computer. You might not know if there are guests in your open space. You might not know if everybody is authorized to be there. It doesn't matter if everybody is authorized to be there. No colleague of yours should have access to your workstation, no matter the reason. So direct local workstation access is also a potential attack vector. Not just for pranks. You know, I'm sure you can think of a couple of pranks here, but we're actually talking about security risks. Also, the cloud has become an important attack vector lately in the last years or so. And simply because a lot of companies now are not exactly moving completely to the cloud, but at least using a couple of services in some public cloud provider out there. Now, what's the problem with this? It's not a problem in itself. It's just that in most situations, access to that infrastructure, that cloud infrastructure, those cloud resources, is actually enforced by a simple account, a simple username and a password. It might be just an API endpoint protecting by a single secret key that allows access to the entire kingdom behind that authentication portal. So it's enough for an attacker to try and guess or break or coerce some employee to reveal those credentials or cloud credentials, and they suddenly have access to more infrastructure that they could ever dream about. Cloud environments are mostly secured just like web applications or more complex web applications, which is convenient on one hand, but it can also pose a great security risk because there's so many resources and critical resources behind a simple user account. And finally, an interesting one is the supply chain attack vector. Now, this one doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it's disastrous. That is, the supply chain attack refers to attacking not the actual network, not the actual devices or the services, but the components or the facilities that come into play while assembling the hardware or the software that finally gets delivered to the end user. Just think how bad would be someday to discover that all the Intel processors in the world have some backdoor installed into them that allows some potential attackers out there to gain access to your computer. That's one type of exploit that has to be installed in the device from the factory itself, which is part of the supply chain. And this is also the reason why a lot of the companies, especially big companies, when they purchase equipment, network devices and user devices, they only purchase from well-known vendors, which have validated and thoroughly checked and secured supply chains, so that the risk of interfering with the production process in a malicious manner is minimized as much as possible. Alright, that's it about attack and attacker categories. Don't forget to leave a comment if you want to talk more or discuss some more about this topic. Like and subscribe, and good luck on the exam. See you on the next video. Bye bye.